Good morning and welcome to the last day of Interact Amsterdam 2020. It's been an amazing 4 days with inspiring talks, and today promises to be the cherry on top. So I hope you guys are ready. I just want to let you know during the presentation you can interact with us via the chat option. And if you have any technical difficulties, just let us know. We'll try to solve them for you. And feel free also to interact with each other. Make sure you have the panelists and attendees on. So yeah, you can chat with each other, say hi. And at the end of the presentation, we'll take questions. You can list those in the Q&A option. I don't think anyone needs a cup of coffee this morning, because the first talk of the day will definitely wake you up. We have Lauren Ellis, who is the UX writer and content designer at Nomensa. And she will talk about how we not just die once, but die twice, because what will happen with all your data, you know, your social media accounts and access to your email account once you pass away. So that's something I definitely I never thought about. So it's very interesting. I can recommend you to also have a look at her background. It kind of fits the presentation. So Lauren, I'm very eager to hear your presentation. All yours.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. I know it's a pretty morbid topic for a Friday morning, but appreciate it nonetheless. So death, we're all going to die. That shouldn't really be something that comes as a surprise to you. If it does, I'm really sorry. This is like an even worse Friday morning for you now. But we know it's going to happen to us basically. And even though kind of death has been this kind of sole truth of our time, we don't really spend that much time kind of sitting around and thinking about it or really kind of reflecting on it. And the way that we kind of feel about death hasn't always looked the same. And how we treat death can tell us a great deal about a culture's anxieties and priorities, as well as things like social, environmental and economic concerns. And whereas things like songs, languages and ceremonies tend to get lost to time, bones and bodies and kind of these items that we're buried with tend to last a very long time. This is why mortuary rituals, which is basically the activities around burial, have been such a key research area for kind of anthropologists since the 19th century. It's a really interesting research area. Hopefully by the end of this talk you'll agree with me and be a bit more deathly. But far from this being this kind of end-of-life formality that kind of just is a thing that we do to get the body into the ground, burial rites tend to encapsulate existential concerns as well as epistemological and metaphysical beliefs. And graveyards and cemeteries and coffins, these are all kind of immediate answers to kind of what is essentially an architectural and design problem. The trouble we face now as kind of like contemporary designers and existence is that our deaths now contain the intangible, and that's not really something that we've kind of had to come up against or really think about yet. So hopefully by the end of this talk you'll have a bit better of an idea. So I'm Lauren Ellis, and this is Designing for the Dead. So I just gotta wait for this bit here to load. But, so almost every single culture dictates this healthy respect and kind of reverence for the dead. You know, we're supposed to honor the wisdom of our long gone relatives and just always respect the dead. That's like a very core tenet in most civilized societies. And alongside this, there's also kind of practical concerns. So humans across time have had to reconcile with just what to do with the decaying bodies of their loved ones. And how we solve this deathly dilemma tends to change alongside cultures, and each choice from the kind of burial location to the grave goods and how we dispose of bodies shows intention and continual change. So none of this is accidental. And just as our ancestors updated their burial practices alongside their cultures, it's time for us to download Death 2.0. And to understand this a little bit better, we're going to go back in time a little bit, and I would like you to imagine a graveyard. So you might be imagining a graveyard like this that's displayed on the screen now. So the first kind of graveyards were actually really different to this, unsurprisingly. I mean, we didn't really have the technology for that back then. But the way that we imagine graveyards today is really different to the way that burial practice actually began. And they're very different from these kind of like elaborate and grand affairs we tend to see in especially Victorian graveyards like Highgate. And so for us to find the first burial, or the first kind of recorded burial, we need to squeeze through a very narrow passageway, and maybe want to bring a headlight because we're going to the earliest gravesite, which is in Israel. So one of the many things that Homo sapiens pride ourselves on is the fact that we have this ability to think abstractly, symbolically, and creatively. Indeed, these abilities, alongside our talent for collaboration and language, helped us to thrive over other species of hominin. But we weren't actually the only smart ones, like back then or even now, really. So as a discovery back in 2013 found, far from this evolution being this slow culmination towards brilliance, really our advancements came in spits and starts. It was, as the writer Anais Nin wrote, we don't grow absolutely or chronologically. We grow sometimes in one dimension and not in another, unevenly, partially. We are relative. And a relative of ours is our very distant cousin, the Homo nideli. Researchers discovered this previously unknown species in the Rising Star Cave system, which is in South Africa, not Israel. The next one's Israel. Anyway, so that was in 2013. And this was really significant. These fossils caused a massive stir. And it wasn't only kind of for this rare mix of primitive and modern features that were found in their bones. A total of 1,500 fossilized bones belonging to at least 15 individuals, these are ranging from infants to elderly adults, were found at the end of this very narrow and barely accessible passageway that was deep inside this cave system. And kind of researchers are kind of confronted with this question. So this location was at the end of a really difficult and arduous journey that would have required squeezing and climbing and crawling through the pitch black kind of on your belly kind of thing. And there's a video of this on YouTube if anyone's interested. The guy's foot kind of comes through this tiny hole. It's really quite terrifying if you're claustrophobic in any way. So it just seemed like it was a kind of impossible place to end up by accident, and almost even more impossible to actually choose to want to live here. So researchers kind of looking at this, what they didn't know was a gravesite yet, kind of came to this hypothesis, which was that 130,000 years ago, our tiny brain ancestor used a somber corner of this cave system as a place to repeatedly and intentionally inter their dead. And this wasn't exactly a uncommon practice at the time. Surprisingly, there were quite a few other examples of kind of contemporary examples there as well. Paleoanthropologists generally believe that burial rites were spiritual dimensions, so kind of not just burying the dead, but doing so for kind of like passage or penance for the next life. Dates back to around 300,000 years ago, so it's like a really ancient practice. And both Neanderthals and the Homo naledi kind of first emerged at this point. Homo sapiens came a little bit later, if I'm not mistaken. So it's a little bit more controversial, the point I'm going to make next, but the Neanderthals were thought to have their own burial practices as well. We kind of have this idea of them that they're this kind of ignorant, kind of brutish group of people that kind of weren't very intelligent, and the more we're finding out about them, it's kind of more that isn't the case. There's evidence that they interred their dead in caves and on mountaintops. Bodies were hidden in trees or kind of sent out to sea. Some of them are cremated and even occasionally cannibalized. And before anyone says that they're not one of our relatives, there's recent evidence that's found that if you're of European descent, your DNA is actually about 3% Neanderthal. So far from this group of humans kind of being kind of eliminated by the rest of us, they were actually kind of assimilated into our population groups, or at least that's one of the readings for now. It may be wrong. It's really hard to kind of get any concrete truth when it comes to kind of history that's so ancient. But anyway, so burial rites are a common practice across the hominin family. And I think what's most significant is that they imply ritual. You know, handling bodies in this way doesn't just relate to kind of handling the problem of the odor. You know, it's not just because these bodies smell that we need to do something about it. There's evidence that both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens made kind of art and jewelry and burial alongside things like grave goods, like tools, for instance. Suggests a kind of rudimentary idea of an afterlife, or at least something that is going to happen next because they need these tools to get there. And this may not sound like a big deal, but mortuary rituals, kind of regardless of their sophistication, signify kind of emotional behavior and a growing capacity for language, or at the very least kind of basic communication. Like, to feel a loss and then feel compelled to kind of mark it on the earth is a very deeply spiritual and philosophical practice. And it kind of hints at this moral or religious framework, because at the bottom of all this kind of hypothesis and loss is the fact that there's a very metaphysical and abstract question, you know, a very distinctly human endeavor, and it's just to kind of ask, not answer. Let me say that sentence again. So it's something very human, and that is basically just to ask those kind of very maybe obvious questions to us now, but really quite kind of like revolutionary, which is, what does it mean to die? Like, what comes afterwards? When we start to ask those questions, like, that's when religion starts to splinter out in response to them. So skipping ahead a little bit in time, we get to the Naledi. So about 10 to 15,000 years ago, something really interesting started happening in human or hominin populations, particularly in North Africa and West Asia, where tribes of hunter-gatherers were kind of swapping their nomadic lifestyles for permanent settlements. And it's kind of at this point that we start to see communal burials. And a beautiful example of this is pictured on the slide here. So this was found in 2013 in Israel, in the Rakifet cave in Mount Carmel. I don't know if I'm saying the cave name right, so you have to forgive me. But, these two bodies, 13,700 years ago, were laid lovingly to rest in a bed of flowers. So you've got like the artist's depiction of it on the right-hand side, but on the left, they found kind of all this like fragments of like pollen and different bits of flowers that were remaining kind of around the bodies. So these bodies belong to the Nefutians, and they lived around 15,000 to 11,000 years ago. They were the first ones to kind of create permanent fishing villages and homesteads and kind of very early agriculture. And they were also the first ones to kind of create cemeteries for multiple generations of the dead. It's really interesting that you see that when tribes kind of stop becoming nomadic, they get tied to the ground more, and then that's when you start to see burials. I'm going to skip forward a little bit in time just because we could talk about this for an hour. So skipping forward a couple of millennia, we arrive at perhaps the most famous of the undertakers. I'd be surprised if anybody doesn't know the Egyptians, but so they're famous for their elaborate burial rites, which involve kind of like 9 stages of judgment. There were brains pulled through noses, mummified cats in crypts. So very famous, all the curses and that kind of thing. But they began their pyramid practice during the 3rd dynasty, which is around 4,000 years ago. There were kind of spells and instructions that were often left on the side of tomb walls. They were known as coffin texts, and they were there essentially to kind of remind the deceased that they needed to leave their mortal body. There were also like amulets and images that were kind of scattered around the tomb as well, which kind of serves to try and ease the person who's dead's anxieties, because they needed to kind of take this very long journey to get to the field of reeds, and it wasn't always easy. So they're almost like signs and signposts for them to be able to get to where they're going. So in Egyptian kind of theology, it said that if or in ancient Egyptian theology even, if a tomb was neglected, a person's spirit could suffer in the afterlife, especially if they hadn't really got to the field of reeds. And there was a lot of steps on the way. So if by any chance this tomb kind of got neglected, it was thought that the soul of the departed would come back and kind of haunt the lazy caretaker. Next, we have the Greeks, who kind of were the first ones to use cemeteries as we know them today. So from the 12th to the 9th century BC, bodies were stored in these kind of like tombs at the edges of cities, initially in groups and then later in individual tombs. In Greek mythology, you have a character called Charon, who is the ferryman, and he won't actually take souls up the river Styx unless they've received a proper burial. So starting to see this kind of like it's important to treat the body with respect and put it in the ground and kind of follow these burial rites through. Similarly, we have these structures called the kurgans, which were kind of giant grave mounds built by the Scythians, I can't say that word, the Scythians, who rode on horseback across Siberia, southern Ukraine and Russia in the kind of 8th to 3rd centuries BC. We see similar examples in like Viking and Anglo-Saxon burials, so it's like very recognizable giant lumps in the ground almost. And then we get to like the Etruscans, who lived in Italy before the Romans. They were the first ones to build necropolises. So these were cities for the dead. And this from like the 9th to the 1st century BC. And when we say like cities of the dead, like these are cities. Some of the sites contain like entire streets and neighborhoods. They've got small squares, kind of all scattered around these hundreds and hundreds of tombs. So it's really interesting. For the purpose of brevity, I'm going to skip ahead again. So we see another big kind of shift in approach when it comes to burial. So there's a lot to be said about burial during the medieval times, but I'm going to kind of focus in on this lovely fellow here, the Danse Macabre, the skeleton. So between the Black Death and events like the 100 Years' War and just general bad health, it's kind of fair to say that a lot of medieval Europeans got a case of the morbs. You know, about a third of the population was killed by the Black Death. So it was something that was kind of like very close and always kind of pulling at their shirt tails almost. And this is best embodied by the dancing skeleton, which started to appear at gravesides from around the 1400s onwards. So the Danse Macabre, as it came to be known, was kind of first featured as a fresco in a Paris cemetery in 1424. And the dance featured the skeleton kind of merrily leading the living to the grave, and everyone is involved in this deathly dance. You know, you've got priests and sinners, paupers and princes, and it just kind of served as a reminder to kind of people passing by or anyone who witnessed the artwork that we're all going to be ending up in the same spot. So you kind of need to enjoy it while we can. It's kind of like the kind of core tenet of memento mori. And while that has been a maxim since it was supposedly whispered into a Roman general's ear kind of centuries ago, it was the Danse Macabre that kind of really captured Europe's attention and started this kind of real appetite for skulls and stuff. You know, you see them everywhere now. And this is a really kind of iconic image. And so we see kind of similar works being inspired across France and Europe, and it continues to this day. I mean, we'll get to the Victorians in a minute, but it really kind of signified this close relationship with death. And so it's kind of important to note as well that the graveyards these kind of figures were appearing in weren't peaceful graveyards like we know them today. They weren't particularly sad or somber places. During the medieval times in Europe, public spaces were actually quite rare. So these mass burial sites kind of doubled as community centres, and they hosted fairs and celebrations, and farmers were even said to use them to graze their cattle because apparently the dead bodies made the milk sweeter, which is quite a horrible thought. Sorry, we're having a coffee. So it's also interesting that not everyone was welcome within the bounds of the church. Those who committed crimes or chose to end their lives were often buried outside of cemetery limits. This often kind of occurred at crossroads, which is where we get this myth around if you stand at crossroads late at night, you might run into the devil. So it's really common in American folklore as well. So it's quite like an old belief. But it is the Victorians that kind of really turn mortality and mourning into an artwork. You kind of see the occult, the spiritual, and the scientific kind of all collided during this time, and it kind of led to the emergence of the mega goth and the image of a cemetery most of us now carry in our minds. You know, for the Victorians and in the UK, so death became a statement, and funerals were really indulgent, and bereavement was this very obvious and public process. And it kind of included wearing like jet black clothing and veils. You had lots of like rings and lockets that contained the deceased's hair. There's a whole kind of other talk we could do about it. But interestingly, so graveside artwork and sculptures this time started to really get filled up with memento mori motifs and symbols. So if you go to places like Highgate in London, for instance, you'll see a lot of, there's images like an urn that's got a kind of sheet over the top, which is to signify like fleeting life and that kind of thing. And also you kind of see at this time the macabre practice of death portraiture. And most interestingly, if you were rich, you could actually pay people to come and weep at your funeral, which you'll see as a kind of continuing theme, that there are a lot of burial practices that are kind of strictly reserved for those with a little bit more money. So during this time as well, the problem of keeping the dead buried also becomes a problem. So as our hunger for science grew, so did this need to kind of invent new ways to scare away grave robbers. Keeping the dead buried was now kind of a very immediate design problem that couldn't be solved just by staking a corpse through the heart like they had done before. This time around, like, it wasn't necessarily like vampires or weird things kind of coming out of the ground to attack the group, like could attack a culture. It was the living that was causing the trouble. So to ward off would-be grave robbers, the Victorians installed lots of different contraptions. One of them is called a mort safe, which is basically a big iron crate that's kind of put around a coffin just as it's after it's been buried. These were so heavy that they were supposed to be removed afterwards, but quite often they weren't. You can still see them kind of like scattered around Europe where there's like a cage coming out. It looks like they're trying to keep the dead body in, but it was really to deter grave robbers. There were also things like rentable cemetery guns, which were installed kind of at the kind of perimeter of a recently buried person, and it kind of stood guard in case anyone triggered a tripwire. Alongside that, you had things like coffin torpedoes, which were laced with explosives and were kind of hidden within the actual casket. And if someone opened it, they would get shot. It's not really clear how much this technology was used, but there was supposedly in January 1881, there was a body snatcher called Dipper who reportedly got killed by one, by a cemetery torpedo in Ohio. And then elsewhere, you also have this really interesting enduring fear that kind of emerges, which is kind of an Edgar Allan Poe story, and then a number of kind of highly publicized accidental burials kind of led to this acute anxiety that I would bet that a lot of people listening also have, which is to be buried alive. Like, what could be more horrifying? And this was, so while today it's just kind of like a horrible abstract thought, back then like it was a very real reality. Like healthcare just wasn't good enough to be able to determine that a person was dead quite often. So there were cases where people did really wake up in their coffins. So we start to see these things called like safety coffins, and these kind of involved like elaborate pulley systems. There were bells attached to tombstones, and there's basically all these different signifiers that would notify people above ground that there was someone below that still had a little bit of life in them. And so whether these inventions are kind of designed to honour the dead or protect us or protect them from us, we've always been a really neurotic species when it comes to our own passing, and this isn't different today. So from all of this history, kind of like, where does this leave us now? So over the last 100 years or so, the pressures facing Homo sapiens has changed, and for the most part, we're all quite lucky that death does seem a bit further away for us. So we're all living longer, we're healthier, and where our ancestors really had to kind of live a long death and look at it in its shallow eyes, we've been able to distance ourselves a bit, and it doesn't really happen in front of us anymore. You know, when people die, it happens in hospitals or in places far away from us. So we're quite protected from it. And there's definitely an argument that maybe not perishing from tuberculosis at 16 or having like a family member it happened to kind of has lured us into this false sense of security where our lives don't really leave any room for our imminent demise. Consumer life cycles don't end, and neither do things like our Apple ID. And all this living doesn't really leave any room for the dead. So this is like isn't a new problem, and it isn't going away. Dealing with kind of the kind of geographical and financial constraints of burying the dead is a very old and continuing problem. Right now, places like Hong Kong and Singapore are kind of trying to figure this out, and so you start to see like some kind of tech solutions to this problem. But we kind of all collectively need to figure out a way to kind of sustainably and efficiently leave the dead in their eternal repose without kind of waking them up and disturbing them every couple of decades to accommodate the living. And so we can kind of see from these different examples that I've shown that each burial type and location has required like specific and intentional decisions, and these reflect the kind of religion and culture of the epoch. So kind of thinking from that, thinking through that lens, what would our design decisions for the dead mean for us? Like, what does our relationship to the Grim Reaper, like what does that signify to our descendants? The existential anguish that comes with thinking about our own deaths kind of also deals with situatedness. It's very much a kind of here and now problem and location bound. The kind of simple question of just where we're going to be laid to rest has been really compounded by how complicated we've become as human beings. And alongside like all of the logistics of death and burial, you know, handling the practicalities of the now dead's earthly possessions and just organising a funeral, we also now have this additional barb of all of our digital luggage. So your digital death. we've all likely seen a dead friend's birthday pop up on Facebook, or had LinkedIn encourage us to kind of congratulate an expired work colleague on an anniversary, which is obviously not an anniversary. But aside from these like occasionally unsettling interactions, most of us never really think about it. We never really think about the implications or what would happen to us if something happened. Well, what would happen if something happened to us? So over half of the UK doesn't actually have a will, and only 1% of us know the funeral requests of our loved ones. We may not really know what we want ourselves or what we would want for our loved ones even, but we do really need to be like pragmatic. And those of us kind of listening today and existing today, we really need to think about kind of beyond the physical when it comes to our eternal wishes. So your digital self is really, really, really complicated. This is kind of only just the beginning of it. So your soul kind of like may have left your body, but that doesn't mean that the internet knows. So when we die, we leave a lot behind. According to Dashlane in 2020, each of us has an average of 207 online accounts. And, you know, that's not to mention like our laptops and personal devices, our photos and videos, social media. We've got different subscriptions, messaging services, you've got emails, and then things like GPS data and cookies, tagged posts. And you've got your bills, Spotify playlists, health data. There's kind of like no end to the amount of data that's being accumulated of us. If you go on like the health app on your phone, you'll be surprised kind of just how much is being recorded even without you really knowing it. I saw the other day that I now know how long my kind of step is because of how it's been tracking my footsteps, which is mad. That's more data that what's that going to happen if I die? And this is kind of just now, we're constantly accumulating more data, and technology is going to continue warping and shaping us in directions that we can't, from where we're standing right now, even really fully imagine or envisage. Like we never know what the next disruption is going to be, because otherwise it wouldn't be disruptive. So we have things like biometrics that are creeping closer, and devices increasingly need like a designated living agent to be able to kind of access and unlock that device. We're only becoming more integrated with technology, so we really need to be thinking about it because it's getting murkier and murkier. Surprisingly, this kind of will does not count. I wish it did. I wish it was as simple as just saying, I've got this on my little necklace. But unsurprisingly, it doesn't count as digital will. And I really get it. No one wants to think about what's going to happen to all of their stuff, you know, tangible or otherwise, when they die. And it's really easy to procrastinate, especially when it's about death, especially when kind of the process of getting your affairs in order is really lengthy and tiresome, often expensive, and really quite scary. But we need to kind of figure out a way to do this. So does your data go to heaven? The jury's still out on whether or not you can bring your digital and physical property with you to the great beyond. Most people don't think you can, but data is intangible, so maybe you can. But for those of us kind of remaining on our earthly plane for now, we have a lot of bureaucracy to deal with. Even if you don't have 207 accounts, maybe you have half of that, that's still a lot of accounts. And those accounts are all going to have different rules and requirements specific to different services, like to each service and also region. So like depending on the country that you're from. So who in your life is going to go through the process of actually validating that they are in fact your next of kin and that they can take over your assets potentially hundreds of times. And this is a really difficult and arduous task to begin with. And it's honestly tragic if you're also trying to grapple at the same time with your grief. You know, you've just lost someone, like that's going to be occupying the most of your brain. Like you don't want to have to be dealing with their like social media accounts. But on the same time, we don't necessarily want anyone to have kind of unfettered access to all of our accounts. You might not mind having your mum have access to things like your email, your bank account, but when it comes to things like private messages or your camera log or anything like your camera roll, you may not want that kind of. We should be able to decide who gets access to that kind of thing. But if we don't do anything about it, it's just kind of a free-for-all. There's also this very complicated matter of ownership when it comes to digital assets. So a lot of us would have had like books and TV shows and that kind of thing that we've bought online, and we don't actually get to take these with us. So back in 2016, PwC reported that on average in the UK, the average UK consumer owns, I think it's like 42 ebooks, 40 TV shows, over 2,000 songs, and none of these legally can be passed on. We're kind of technically renting them when it exists digitally. And even our kind of intellectual property rights get really tricky after death as well. You need to kind of look no further than the plethora of posthumously published works of literature. You people like Franz Kafka, for instance, who in his will, he explicitly said, "I don't want my work published." And his friend completely ignored him and kind of just went with it anyway, because, you shouldn't speak ill of the dead, but you can't really argue back with you either. So you kind of don't really get a say in it anymore, unless you believe in ghosts, but that's a whole other thing. So the trouble here kind of comes in three parts. So you might have a couple of ideas around what you want to have for your post-life wishes, but we don't actually have a lot of control over this, like as it stands right now. So this is kind of comes in three ways. So you have unclear laws detailing digital assets and data. There's also low user comprehension, and then reactionary policy changes. So we as consumers don't always know what we're agreeing to. According to the most recent digital death survey in 2018, about 46% of us are really unfamiliar with all of the policies and laws and regulations that apply to online accounts when we die. I would say that it's probably a bit higher than that, but most people also aren't answering a digital death survey unless they're like me. So a lot of us don't really know what we can do or what we're allowed to do. And part of this is really kind of due to how complicated legal content is when you kind of get to your terms and conditions. So at best, like, terms and conditions are really long and boring, and if we're honest, most of us won't read them. And one study found that if we did, it would take about 76 days a year. And that was over a decade ago, when our digital footprints were a lot smaller. So you can imagine that it's kind of only got worse since then. So legal and policy content are kind of one of the last frontiers of plain English, and I would argue that it's where we need it most. Not kind of advocating to have bills in front of Parliament put in plain English or put in like layman's terms. I am a writer and I love complicated diction, but for user-facing content, we really need to write in language that people understand. It's like a content designer, this is really kind of core to my role, where it's our job to make it easy for the user, and we need to make it clear, and we need to make it kind of understandable for them so they know what their rights are and what they're agreeing to. That role is like really important when it kind of happens on a day-to-day level, but when it comes to things like our rights, our data privacy, and the potential burden we could put on our loved ones, like, it's really pertinent that we get it right. Secondly, we have like legal black holes and unnatural bodies. So part of the problem is that this is such a modern issue. It hasn't kind of, I don't know if any of you saw the Zuckerberg Senate hearing a few years ago, but it was really clear as you're watching this interview that a lot of the people who are writing the laws and controlling the laws don't necessarily have a good grasp of technology, and law kind of has a hard time trying to catch up and kind of constantly playing catch up with technology. And the laws that we do have really tend to only apply to natural bodies. So this is like mainly in the UK. And natural bodies are referred to as like living, breathing human beings. So like us kind of listening to this now. And things like privacy are kind of entrenched in the Declaration of Human Rights, and has been since 1948. But it's only like natural bodies that have legal personalities and therefore have a claim to privacy. So you have the same thing in the US, where there are no laws specifying kind of post-mortem privacy protection, like beyond property rights. Even with recent advancements like GDPR, the dead and their data just really aren't covered. And this is like problematic for us as individuals, but kind of as the extreme end, you start to see things like Whitney Houston's hologram, for instance, who is currently kind of touring, and she's kind of condemned to perform nightly forever. Or you have like James Dean, who's apparently being brought back from the grave to star in a new film. Seems really terrifying to me. For the rest of us, we may not kind of have that problem, but limited law does mean that our loved ones could lose access to our accounts. They could lose access to our photographs, our messages, and just kind of pieces of digital ephemera that really become really meaningful after someone dies. And like, in addition to that, you could have your identity stolen. You could have your accounts hacked and used to sell things. There's a really brilliant book by Elaine Casket called All the Ghosts in the Machine, and I'd really encourage you all to read it if you're interested, because I'm really only scratching the surface of the legal side of things, and she goes in, and she's a brilliant writer as well, so it's a good read. So finally, on this side, we have a wild west of policy changes. So kind of the lack of regulation at the top means that all these different kind of companies are kind of it just becomes this kind of like wild west of different policies and verification strategies. There's no kind of consistency in the way that we approach them. And generally companies tend to be reactive rather than proactive when it comes to dealing with the dead. So they'll kind of respond to a legal dispute or like a user complaint, and then they'll change the policy, but they won't necessarily apply consistency in their thinking. So we end up seeing this thing where we're plastering over a small kind of problem in the system, but we're not taking a holistic approach to actually fix it, or even kind of thinking about it at all. We're just like, all right, well, we'll just give this woman access to her son's Facebook account, but that doesn't actually fix the problem. So to make matters worse here, every single platform's term of service is slightly different, and the death of a user is often an afterthought in it. There have been recent features like Google's inactive account manager and then Facebook's legacy contacts, like have both been established recently, but they're kind of last minute additions that came from public outcries. Instagram has recently started bringing in a memoriam one, but again, this is like just happening now, and around 8,000 people die on Facebook every day. And we as practitioners may not have like millions of departed users, but we really need to think about end of service design, which is something I'm going to talk about in the latter half of this presentation. But also, it's not all bad, you know, tucked into this terror, you know, there's like a real loveliness here. When we lose someone, anything they like once touched becomes really precious to us, and we just want to keep those things nearby. And we in the past would have had like shoeboxes full of like half forgotten mementos and old photographs as a way of kind of tethering ourselves to what once was, like holding these tangible objects. And if we were lucky, maybe we've got some like old footage of them, maybe we can hear their voice, but overwhelmingly, like we don't have a lot of kind of assets or anything kind of remaining of the people that we loved before that died. Whereas now it's completely different. Like we're creating this data constantly, and we shouldn't underestimate digital ephemera. So around 41% of people find digital remains comforting. And unlike a cemetery, no one's going to think that you're a ghost or call the police if you kind of visit someone's memorial page on Facebook at 3 a.m. Whereas if you try and break into a graveyard at that time, you're going to be in trouble. So whoever loses us is going to be kind of gifted with this seemingly infinite amount of information around us. You know, some of it's going to be boring, like spam sent to our emails, but in amongst this kind of very mundane digital mess, we also have like text messages and Facebook exchanges and things from like posts from when we were teenagers that were embarrassing, but also quite nice to return to. And we have this digital trail that builds a more complete version of us. And yeah, the negative side of it, if I'm being cynical, is that it makes us easier to sell to, but it could also help us mourn each other better as well. And we're really lucky that we're now at this time where we don't need to carry around like faded lockets or these little like debugs, whatever they're called. We have like whole photo albums just on our phones that we can just look at whenever we want to. Like our attachment to people is so much closer than it used to be. So finally here, what can you do as an individual? So I'm going to talk about what you can do as a practitioner in a second. But for now, like what steps can you take? Start by kind of thinking about your own death. Make some decisions now. Don't be afraid to scare your family. They probably should think that you're weird. If they don't, you're probably doing something wrong. So think about things like maybe you've decided you're on your funeral song, and maybe you know that you'd like to be kind of buried rather than cremated. I personally want to have a willow tree planted above me, but you know, there's lots of different options. We need to be thinking about it. And alongside the kind of the more interesting sides of organising a funeral, there's also the kind of boring admin bits, which is where we tend to trip up more. Planning a funeral is way easier than kind of actually dealing with the bureaucracy of death. So you have to get things like considering your end of life wishes. You know, you could do this through advanced care plans or advanced directives. Also think about your digital demise. So what do you want to have happen to your accounts? Maybe you want like your Instagram to stay, but something like LinkedIn doesn't seem that important. Maybe you want to delete everything and go like kind of full tabula rasa and just have no digital footprint left. Maybe you want to have like a memorialized account. There are lots of different things that we can choose, and there are companies that are kind of trying to handle this admin, but it's really kind of up to us to think about it. Does anybody know kind of your passwords to social media accounts, like your online banking or your laptops and devices. This is like bad cybersecurity, but for the purpose of dying, like you do kind of need to tell people. At the end of this presentation, I've also included a kind of social media template, which comes from the Digital Legacy Association, and you can print it out and just kind of add in different passwords and stuff. It's worth kind of noting as well, though, that you can't actually write your password in a will because a will is technically a public document. So this is a whole other thing that we need to fix as well. But something you can do immediately is appoint someone as your legacy contact on Facebook. So they can't read your messages, but it just basically means that if anything happens to you, they get control of your account and nothing's going to happen. So beyond our own deaths, though, I also really want to dwell on like what we can do as practitioners. You know, this festival is kind of about doing things better and designing better and kind of really cementing human-centered practices in the way that we work. And we're in this really unique position where we actually get to do something about it. Like we get to complain about the digital system, but at the same time, we create these systems, so we're empowered to do something. And didn't mean to skip this then. Let me just get back a slide. So we can do things better if we kind of make better design choices now. You know, these subtle changes could make mourning for someone somewhere a little bit easier. And if it does, I say we should do it. You know, grief is big enough and ugly enough without having to try and decipher someone's passwords. And fortunately, I'm not the first person to come to this conclusion. And so we have something called thanatosensitivity. So we've always been better at building things than we are at disposing of them. You know, we need to look no further than the local tip to see that the products we consume are really only half imagined. So you have like the beginning, the enticement, got the purchase, and the kind of the use are all simple enough. Like those are designed in. But when it comes to the end, like we kind of trip up there. And thanatosensitivity is basically a way of approaching design problems that kind of seeks to change that. So according to its creators, it is a novel, humanistically grounded approach to human-computer interaction research and design that recognises and actively engages with the facts of mortality, and death in the creation of interactive systems. Essentially, it designs mortality into our UX practice. You could think of it as a lens of identifying potential design problems and also kind of considerations for choosing solutions. And this doesn't necessarily mean to be the death of the user as well. It could just be the end of our journey together. So this, the theory is kind of split into 4 chunks. So we're going to walk through those quickly now. So firstly, we have user modeling. So nobody wants their user to disappear. That's kind of obvious, but sometimes they don't really need to stick around. And once the task is done and the product is kind of fully consumed, we have this space left and the ending just really isn't designed. So when we're kind of proposing solutions, we need to think about things like, are the users that we're kind of targeting, are we considering that they might be at very different ages and some of them will likely outlive the others? Does that fact actually have an impact on the design system? Like, does it need to matter? And do our cognitive models, consumer cycles and user stories account for a user's eventual demise? And if it's not their death, have we at least kind of considered what happens at the end of their relationship or use of service? Have you also considered what happens with a system, within a system when it comes to user and activity? If someone hasn't used their account for a long time, are they given an option to close that account? So it may sound counterintuitive, but it's important that we make it as easy to leave a system as it is to sign up. After all, you don't want your partner only staying with you because they can't find the front door. You know, they have to want it. The other thing to do is review research practices. So can we ask a grieving person to navigate a new prototype? The answer is yes, but we do need to do so kind of kindly, sensitively, and ethically, as we would do for like any other vulnerable user group. And we can kind of bring it into our practice by, in like usability sessions, we can be asking participants, you know, are they thinking about their own deaths when they're answering? What about the mortality of others? Are you comfortable asking these questions? And also, are they comfortable asking them? You know, it's a new way of doing things, and we need to kind of figure out how best to do it. You also need to think about things like, does your data handling policy kind of detail any stipulations around what happens if a participant dies? Is it useful to keep their data? Like, do you need to kind of pour through all of it and get rid of the dead data? Is the kind of question that organizations need to kind of be answering. And are there also any standards in place to do any research under Thanatos sensitive conditions? Do our current methodologies work, or do we need to adapt them? I kind of believe the latter. I think we need to be updating. So privacy, we kind of seen how death changes what we deem private information, and really just like the dizzying lack of legislation around it. The question isn't just kind of about who controls your data when you're alive, but who gets access to it once you die. And there are economic factors as well. So for organizations, memorializing accounts and profiles won't necessarily work for every account or service, won't work for every service. And for most systems, like keeping the dead's data on record can weigh on community platform teams, and it can also kind of muddle targeting when it comes to marketing new products. So we really need to be kind of thinking more about data. We need to be considering what is inheritable data, are devices and data private after death, and who gets to decide if they are? If you say that, yeah, we do get to have access, who's then responsible for managing that data and the privacy of the deceased? And really importantly, like, what can we do to make it easier for people to manage their own end of life wishes? Organizations really need to find a way to kind of handle this ever-growing mountain of inactive and dormant or dead consumer accounts and personal data. After all, we can't make effective business decisions if the data we're operating from is effectively a graveyard. It's just shouting into the void. Finally, and probably most controversially, we have intelligent agents. So these could be AI algorithms, they could be robots pieced together by machine learning, or kind of social media accounts that are programmed to post like pre-written messages on friends' birthdays or on life events. It could be a hologram that kind of comes complete with all of our quirks, thoughts and memories. These kind of technologies attempt to kind of allow our non-physical selves to continue in some way. Some of you may have seen the hologram that Kim Kardashian got for her birthday of her deceased dad. And that kind of caused like a massive stir, because some people thought that it was really sweet, others thought it was really kind of quite surreal. But do we want something like that for ourselves? And we want it for our loved ones? And also, kind of, can we even afford it? If we aren't married to the world's most genius man, this is something that we're going to be answering more and more and more. Technology is only going to get weirder when it comes to death. So what we can do as practitioners is kind of ask things like, well, as practitioners and philosophers, I would say. So do you want to be creating systems where intelligent personal agents can continue making actions after death? Is it morally and ethically appropriate to create those systems? And if we decide that we do, what behaviors should we allow these digital zombies to exhibit? Would you want a digital avatar of yourself that your loved ones could commune with after you die? Would you want to put your personality into a robot, for instance? And who actually gets to decide what the dead say once they're there? Is it predetermined by the people who are kind of keying it into the system, or the person who's died? Or is it kind of like a post-mortem copyrights where, after a set amount of time, like anybody has kind of fair game to use this media? And interestingly, the digital death survey again found that so 62 and 78% of people responded to the kind of with the resounding no to having a robot, a digital avatar. And I don't know, I just think it's kind of really easy to kind of say when there's a lot of life in front of us and from the comfort of our homes, for instance. Maybe I'll reappear as the Grim Reaper on your deathbed and ask you again. It's also a really wonderful talk by Pete Traynor on YouTube that's titled More Than Humanly Possible. I would really recommend you watch it, because regardless of where you fall on these questions, like, it's going to make you reconsider, and just it's brilliant. So these technologies aren't actually that far away. So intelligent agents sound kind of slightly far-fetched, but there are already companies that are stepping in to give us control. The Forever Social, which is the kind of yellowy one on the side here, is a platform geared at giving intelligent agents, which is basically you but dead, more control over your post-mortem communications. You can send videos and messages, and also make some choices about your data. So kind of looking at this image on the kind of the yellowy one, how does it make you feel? Are you comfortable with the site's language and intention and direction? Would you personally sign up for the service? And there's really no right or wrong answer to this. The important thing is that we're asking the questions and we're really dwelling on this. And this is only going to kind of continue. So with biometrics, there's also like transhumanists who want to live forever. It could be that at some point we really do have immortality, but luckily, at least from my perception, luckily for now, we are stuck in our fleshy mortal forms. But we're already starting to see plenty of examples of like gravesite technology. There are things like QR codes that appear on gravestones. In Japan, there are even these VR apps that kind of project 2D depiction of grandparents, or you can kind of choose whoever you want. And the example was grandparents, and they kind of projected Pokemon Go style onto chosen locations. You know, they kind of like stand around and they dispel like comforting phrases like "you're doing your best" and "hang on in there." And I am being kind of facetious about all of this, but at the same time, like technology, if it hasn't driven through the uncanny valley, can be a tremendous comfort. But like all things and all human creations, really, technology is a mirror, and we kind of get back what we pour in. So what can we do kind of to bring this into our practice? We've kind of seen how thanatosensitivity, we can approach problems in a certain way. But the kind of key takeaways from this talk, I'm just going to kind of run through with you now. So this is how we can actually design for the dead. First of all, kind of change your thinking. So take a step out of your intellectual comfort zone. You know, the best ideas come from people who are kind of willing to find connections and commonalities between maybe slightly unorthodox sources. And we may not have all the answers yet, but we have got a really, really, really rich history of thought to tap into. Humans have really never not been dying. So we need to look further ahead, like further afield than just UX. We kind of need to be embracing the humanities and philosophy and the arts, you know, as a conduit for understanding, as a source for solutions. As UXers, this may be a new problem that we're like trying to answer, but humans have been trying to figure out death since we've been able to kind of cognate. So just kind of look around a little bit more, I guess, and read up on the existentialists, because everybody ought to. And we also want to be designing around human behavior. So humans are naturally lazy, and it is our job as practitioners to kind of design around this human fallibility. We should, as the kind of frequently touted GDS principle goes, do the hard work of making it easy for our users. This means making it as straightforward to leave as it was to sign up, and ensuring that decisions for data, both now and in death, are, you know, simple, time effective, and human centered. So, for example, you can look at terms and conditions, for instance. User engagement for terms and conditions like varies massively depending on where in the journey it appears. So usually when we're kind of confronted with the big text box that's like, you need to agree to our new terms, it tends to be like just as we're about to complete a task, which increases that likelihood of just blindly tapping without reading anything. But if policy content is visible somewhere else, like for instance, like on a landing page when you're browsing, people are much more likely to interact with it because they're doing so kind of when they're less task oriented. And if those policies, when you get there, are then written in plain English, you know, that's even better. So we also want to be collaborating with each other. Mourning rituals and burials have always been a communal activity. You know, our digital deaths are no different, but we are communal creatures. And we do all grieve differently. So it is really difficult to kind of standardize something that's so religious and so specific to a religion, culture, place, or person. But by working together and learning from each other, we can really kind of design in a way that accepts the shared mortality, and we should hopefully get better at it over time. And there's a lot of good work that's being done already that we can be inspired by. In the UK, there's the kind of tell us once policy, which is basically allows users to report a death to most government organisations in one go. So you don't have to go to all the different ones anymore. So it's a single service, you sign in, say the name, you have to supply obviously evidence for the person's death, but it just simplifies that task. You also have places locally to us, so like Bath University has the Centre of Death and Society, which is basically dedicated to researching all of this. And it is slightly trickier in the private sector, but there are also organisations like death.io who are kind of trying to demystify digital death and also help with the rest of the funeral as well. You know, it's really kind of championing this, just thinking about our own deaths and what we can do about it and taking control of it. So kind of lean on each other. You know, these conversations are already happening, so just kind of like listen and just focus on improving the corner of the world or system or whatever website that you're working on. So just from our little pocket. So design endings as well. We don't necessarily want to think about the end, but as human beings, we really need them. That's why we've created like entire ceremonies around it. We need something that kind of says to us and signifies that, you know, we were here, this happened, and it's over now. Our emotional needs are no different just because we're interacting with a consumable product or kind of finite digital service. humans are still humans, like regardless of where we're kind of appearing. And as we kind of said before, this ending doesn't necessarily need to be the death of the user. We may, as organizations, want to be focusing on like customer acquisition and showing off new features or finessing onboarding, but all good things have to come to an end. And an ending can also be an opportunity to really kind of engage with our audience emotionally and forge stronger bonds with them. And maybe they're more likely to come back if you don't make it so hard to go. Joe McLeod has a really good and excellent book on the subject that's aptly titled Ends. Add that to your reading list as well. There's a reading list at the end of this presentation. So you don't need to scribble it down. But truthfully, we all kind of know that if we really care about our users, like we kind of need to let them go sometimes and just trust that they'll come back. Finally, and most importantly, hang out in your local graveyard. So when asked to live how to live a more authentic life, the famous German philosopher Martin Heidegger said, you should spend more time in graveyards. And this is because, as Heidegger wrote, we are beings that are ever driven towards death. And in order to live an authentic life, we have to really live in constant awareness of that mortality and answer the question of what it means specifically to us. You know, if we choose, death can be something that frees us from a lot of the absurd nonsense we spend a lot of our times worrying about. And it can push us to be more grateful and patient and a little bit kinder to ourselves and everyone around us. And, you know, even though I've just spent the last hour talking about death, like we really don't need to worry about it too much. The finite nature of our lives are what give our existences meaning. So tomorrow, because it's now Friday, so why not take a trip down to a local cemetery this weekend? We're under lockdown here, but we're allowed to go for a walk. But, you know, hopefully kind of strolling through the graves will kind of remind you that we have a really, really short amount of time on this very small and very strange planet. And so it's kind of worth leaving it a little bit better than we found it. Thank you. And so, yeah, that was designing for the day.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Reading
list for emos. Okay, cool. That was really interesting. As I said, I never really thought about it. I saw it popping up every now and then on LinkedIn so I don't see any specific questions, more as comments. Although I think Charles Martin has a good point. You briefly mentioned that you can actually appoint someone on your Facebook to be, okay, so that option actually exists on Facebook.
So the Facebook legacy contact, if you go onto like your profile, it's under settings. It's quite visible in the IA, which is quite interesting. But yeah, it's quite easy. You just assign a person. They don't have to do anything. They get a little message saying, hey, you're my legacy contact. But it's quite quick to do. There are some organizations are starting to do this work, but it's kind of very ad hoc at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very young industry, I can imagine. If there are any questions, we still have 2 minutes. So if anyone wants to, actually like that picture very much.
Yeah, this is Charles Bukowski. It's not actually Heidegger, but I think Bukowski and Heidegger would have got on really well.
If there are no questions, I don't see anything coming in. Do I see any? Wait, the QA one. Oh yeah, I have a question. Have you personally arranged anything for your digital legacy?
Yeah, so I'm starting to. It's, again, I'm a slight hypocrite here because I'm preaching the good word without actually following it completely. But I am starting to kind of do it. I'm trying to start on like my social media and kind of just talk about it as well, actually. So there's a lot that I'm kind of only scratching the surface on, but I'm trying to do the work and trying to get it sorted. And a lot, the more like practical stuff about like my funeral, I think people know, but it's the kind of the admin side that I'm slightly stalling on. But
yeah. I can imagine. I wouldn't know where to start.
Yeah,
I mean, I would not want anyone getting a postcard with a hologram of me singing "Happy Birthday."
But I know, that would be horrible.
It's insane. Yeah, I mean, Matthew Petrie is saying, just want to say, having lost a family member recently, this has made me think and will get some wheels in motion. Thanks for the talk. Lisa Anderson says, nice job. You get a lot of bravos here. So thank you. It's 11 Amsterdam time, 10. Okay. Quick one by Charles Martin. So if there was a monetary value to your digital legacy, the government would want you to declare it so they could tax it. So how do we value it? If it has a value, then everyone would appoint a guardian. That was the question.
I have So I guess there probably is a monetary value to our digital legacy, but I wouldn't know how to begin to qualify it. I mean, it probably would be helpful if there was some sort of like monetary value attached to it, because that is something that does tend to motivate us. Don't know if we would tax it. And then everyone has a value. Yeah, I'm not really sure on that one, Charlie. Sorry.
I have to think about it.
Yeah, I'll have a think on that one, because it's a good question. I mean,
we might get back in the email.
Yeah, like about it gets very hard to quantify. I wouldn't even know where to begin, but it probably would motivate people to actually kind of assign a guardian. So maybe the government needs to tax it, and then we'll do something about it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I found it very insightful. I'll definitely start thinking about it a lot more. Not sure if I will hang out at the graveyard tomorrow, but
give it a go. Just need to find a nice one. To go for the Victorian one. It's lovely.
For anyone who's watching, thank you very much. The next talk will be at 2 p.m. Amsterdam time, 1 p.m. London time. It will be with Jenny Heiboom and Gerjan Boer from ABN AMRO and True Experience. So we hope to see you then. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your morning.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.